We are back today with our new session on the history of social democracy across Europe. And we're here with Jonah Birch, who's a visiting assistant professor at Marquette University and a contributing editor at Jacobin. Thank you so much, Jonah, for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I feel like with this headset, I'm about to blow up the Death Star, but you know, it's always good to talk about this stuff. Go ahead.
Great.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
So yeah, let's begin at the beginning, I suppose. French social democracy, I think, has a very interesting and I think in many ways fairly unique history that I think often kind of goes overlooked because of how the communist movement has been so prominent in the history of the 20th century left in France.
Right.
So good, just at the broadest kind of level. Can you walk us through some of the origins of French social democracy, kind of during the later part of the 19th century into the Second International period, and some of the things that make the French socialist movement during this period both similar to the other parties of the Second International during this time, but also somewhat unique.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so, I should say I'm not an expert on the early days of French socialism, but there's such a long, this rich political history, goes back to the French Revolution, some ways even before, but, and throughout the 19th century, always, these radical movements for democracy in France, where there were a series of revolutionary movements, people probably have some sense, 1830, 1848, 1871, kind of just the tip of the iceberg, but as the most prominent example, maybe people have seen, Les Mis or something. But those movements for democracy were always, not always, but often fused with the kind of the movements for some change to a more just social order, and most famously in 1848, the February movement revolution that overthrew the monarchy then, Louis Philippe, was a movement led by workers in Paris and, fighting for, essentially for work, guaranteed work, and for relief for the poor and the unemployed. And then 1871, the Paris Commune, after the defeat of Napoleon III, Louis Napoleon, and France by Germany, the workers taking over Paris for months and trying to run it themselves as they're surrounded by, this army of counter-revolutionary army, essentially. These are really important historical examples. By the end of the 19th century, you had a French socialist movement that was very strong in some ways, very influential, very divided, different wings of it, always very organizationally divided, politically divided. You didn't get the same kind of centralized socialist, party that you got like the SPD in Germany. That wasn't the organizational or political dynamic there. French capitalism looked quite different. In a lot of ways was much more underdeveloped compared to German or English for quite a long time. There was a very, very strong still peasantry and section of the economy that was dominated by kind of small producers, had always been very influential on the political left. So, and so then there's this whole history during what's called the Third Republic from 1871 until, the defeat at the hands of the Nazis. And that's a very rich history, which we're not going to go into. The French socialism and some of the fights there and some of the successes, particularly, during the 30s, the election of Léon Blum and the Popular Front government. By the end of World War II, let's say, you're following the liberation. You have the creation of what's called the Fourth Republic. So the fourth, these are a series of attempts to create Republican government. The first was during the French Revolution, right? So it goes back to the end of the 18th century. And the Fourth Republic, which replaces the Nazis in northern France, and then Vichy, the kind of collaborationist regime in southern France. It's dealing with this process of this effort, the need to rebuild an economy that has been absolutely shattered, a political order that has been destroyed by the years of Nazi occupation, by this legacy of collaborationism, and they're doing it under and then the Cold War divisions, which are emerging after the war, and they're doing it under this parliamentary system with a pretty weak executive. You have a series of mostly pretty short-lived governments, different types of coalition governments, and on the left, what you have is this very interesting division between an extremely strong, but after 1947, very marginal communist movement, right? It took a lot of credit for leading the resistance during World War II to the Nazis, and really dominated the labor movement via its links with the largest trade union confederation. Unions in France were always divided. So its union was the CGT, the General Confederation of Workers, and which was the largest of the trade unions. So it was very strong, and it was very strong in local government, but it was totally politically marginalized. And then this very fragmented series of, different kind of reformist, pretty moderate mostly, socialist parties. And that included the SFIO, the French section of the Second International, the kind of, but there were different parties associated with different figures that emerged, during the after World War II, during the late 40s and into the 50s. So it's this very complicated situation. They were at odds, the socialists and the communists, very strongly. The communists were they were stigmatized by these kinds of Cold War divisions, and that really shaped the way other people approached them. Then during the 1950s, you have this political crisis of the Fourth International, which collapses for a number of reasons, most fundamentally because France is involved in a series of losing colonial wars, the bloodiest of which was in Algeria, but also in Vietnam. I mean, before the United States was in Vietnam, it was a French colony for a century, basically, and the French were defeated at Dien Bien Phu. Anyway, so in 1954, but there are these defeats in these colonial wars, and it really essentially destroys the Fourth Republic. So it brings down the Fourth Republic, and in 1958, there is a coup led by the hero of the resistance, Charles de Gaulle, who has been out of politics since right after World War II. And he's kind of still the figure that looms over everything, a kind of conservative nationalist modernizing figure. And he institutes out of this, and he's promising we're going to win the war in Algeria, or he's a little ambivalent about it, but he's supported by people who want to continue the war in Algeria, keep Algeria. Out of this, he creates Fifth Republic, which is what exists now. Strong executive, very strong executive, strong, people call it a monarchical presidency. And he kind of constructs this political and social order after 1958. Now, de Gaulle gets in trouble with the right after 58 because he ends up making peace and granting Algerian independence. So he pisses off the right. Some Algerian ultra, revanchists and people in the army tried to lead a coup against him later in the early 1960s, try and assassinate him. But he survives that, and he is the dominant political figure in France through the 1960s. So the dominant political figure, and he hates the communists. Yeah. And the left. He really hates the left. His real enemy is the left. That was a very long-winded answer to your very simple question. Too long-winded?
No, that was great. That was super interesting. I would love, you mentioned there are so many political divisions and so many competing parties. And I'd love to hear just a little bit more about the differences between the communists and the socialist parties, in what kind of vision they're offering for society, who their base is. And also you mentioned the CGT, but what were the other unions doing? What was the labor movement's orientation to all these parties?
Yeah. So the labor movement in France, let me start there, is super divided. It has always been divided along political lines, essentially, first and foremost, right? So today, there are a number of many different trade union confederations which organize workers in different industries. Often, so in France, there's no closed shop, so they compete for influence in the same workplaces, right? And anyway, and they're divided. The two biggest today are the CGT, which since the mid-90s is no longer affiliated with the Communist Party, but it's still the kind of militant wing, leader of the militant wing of French labor, and the CFDT, the French Democratic Confederation of Workers, which, and this is complicated, it is today kind of collaborates with neoliberal reformers, and in a complicated way, often with management, is seen as the more accommodationist union. Yes, the CFDT, the more accommodationist union, very interesting history. And its origins actually go back to the kind of Catholic trade unionism, fascinatingly, which was another wing of the French labor movement after World War II. I don't want to give too many acronyms to confuse people, but the key thing is, so they come out of a union called the CFTC, the Catholic, the Christian Trade Union Confederation. The key thing is that France never develops the institutions of social democracy in the way you get in some parts of Northern Europe. Not even like some of them. It has, so the labor movement is totally divided. The unions are not granted almost any institutional power within the economy. There's a limited role for collective bargaining, like officially, in part because very explicitly, de Gaulle was worried that the communists were too influential in the trade union movement, and he wanted to limit their control over the economic system, right? Also, those Cold War divisions play out internally inside the labor movement. So the big unions after World War II are the CGT, the Communist Union, the Catholic Union, which later the CFDT will split from and kind of develop its own radical politics for a period of time before evolving into what it is today, this accommodationist union. And then, the other big one that people should probably know is FO, Force Ouvrière, which is it's basically an anti-communist split after World War II from the CGT. It presents itself as kind of apolitical, pure and simple trade unionism. What makes all of this so complicated is that, so these unions are fighting for influence in different workplaces. You can't really measure their influence by membership figures exactly, because trade union membership means something different in France than it does here, right? You join a trade union in France if you want to be an activist. You don't have to be in a trade union to be covered by a collective bargaining agreement. There was this complicated set of rules and procedures set up after World War II by which unions could get recognition from the state as an official recognized trade union. And then if a representative union signed a collective bargaining agreement in an industry, essentially the labor ministry could extend it to all the workers in an industry. So you could have, theoretically you could have a workplace with zero trade union members covered by a collective bargaining agreement signed by a trade union. Confusing, I know. Anyway, the CGT was the dominant trade union. I know I'm getting out of my American and back into my French pronunciation. Was the dominant trade union after World War II. It's hard to figure out from afar what everything you really have to look up close to understand kind of the different dynamics of the unions. The thing is, there are different sections to the left that end up being connected with all of these different unions. And by the 70s, as French society, and I know we'll talk about this, after May 68 is radicalizing, and The different factions of moderate socialism are radicalizing. Even the non-communist unions are coming out with these really radical reform agendas. If you read what even the CFDT, the split from the Catholic Union, now an accommodationist trade union, is saying in the 1970s, they're like, we're for socialism. We believe in class struggle unionism. There will be no peace with the bosses. Like, this is what they're writing, right? I mean, and they have all this vision of worker self-management and, urban planning and working time reduction, where they really push the 35-hour work week, right? All of that stuff. So it isn't as easy to say there's the left unions and then the right unions. The evolution is a bit more complicated than that. Now, within the socialist movement, it's better to think about, so there's the communists. They're winning a quarter of the vote for decades after World War II. They have a huge membership base. They control, there was these areas, for example, these little towns outside of Paris called the Red Belt outside of Paris. Bobigny, Aubervilliers, Saint-Denis, and the communists just controlled them all, right? I mean, I think at the peak of their local power, their municipal power in the late 70s, they ran local government in like a third of medium and large sized cities in France. So the communists are very strong. Then on the socialist left, where people are more influential in parliament, right? Because they're able to cut deals with more centrist forces. You have these different figures who are, and it's better to think it rather than in terms of parties, think about figures. Guy Mollet, we call him Pierre Mendès France, and then of course Mitterrand. And Mitterrand, who we're going to be talking about today, is originally, actually as a young person, he was on the right. He had supported Vichy before becoming part of the resistance. And in the 50s, he's just one of, he's not at all the most important socialist figure on the moderate socialist left, right? He's in a couple governments, brief governments, and he does some pretty messed up stuff, to be honest, like including he was the justice minister briefly during war in Algeria. He signed these death warrants for the execution of Algerian nationalist fighters. He had been he said, famously, his line on Algeria, it was, c'est France, that Algeria, that's France, it's ours, basically. And he later apologized for all of that. In the 60s, at the kind of peak of Gaullist rule, the Gaulle is in power, he's constructed the Fifth Republic. Mitterrand starts to emerge really as this kind of leading figure. And he is simultaneously like, we want to replace the communists as the dominant figure in France. I want to unite everyone behind me. We want the socialists to replace the communists as the dominant force on the French left. But also he starts to figure out, it means we need to cut a deal with we can't. So he runs for president against de Gaulle in 65 and loses. And then would run again in 74 and lose again, against one of de Gaulle's successors. But he's starting to think strategically about his role in all of this. At the end of the 1960s, after May 68, which we should definitely talk about, the big protest movement, the great upheavals in modern European history, all these different little socialist groups start to come together and form what would become the modern Socialist Party, the PS, right? Mitterrand enters the PS in 1971 and becomes its kind of standard bearer. Maybe I should wait. I have some quotes, the famous from his speech at this Congress where he enters. Should we wait?
Well, yeah. Yeah, I would hold off on that for now.
Yeah.
I guess before we continue with Mitterrand and how the PS winds up becoming the leading force on the French left during that period. It might be interesting to kind of take a step back and talk a little bit about how it was the communists who wound up becoming the leading force on the French left in the immediate post-war era, because along with Italy, France is quite unique for having the Communist Party and the Communist movement be playing the leading or kind of the largest role in the left. It's very rare for Western European countries, generally speaking. So, why is it that it's the communists who are able to establish themselves as kind of the leading force, at least in terms of membership or vote totals, if not kind of national level political power? Is it simply a story of their role in the French resistance?
Yeah.
Or is it that, along with other factors that go into explaining how that process played out?
That's a great question, and you're absolutely right. So in Western Europe, on the western side of whatever the Iron Curtain or whatever you want to of the Cold War division in Europe, among the democracies, only in France and Italy, I think that's right, were the communists the dominant force on the left post World War II. I mean, probably you could say in Spain still, but it was a dictatorship, right? They were underground. Maybe in Portugal under Salazar, but yeah, I think that's really right. Clearly, it's clear that the discrediting of the parties of the Third Republic, right, and then the impact of the Nazi occupation and of Vichy has a huge role to play in this, right? I mean, a really big role. But the other thing is that even in the 30s, I mean, again, I'm not an expert on kind of the French left or the French labor movement during the interwar period. My impression is that already, if you go to some of these big factories outside, the big Renault factories outside of Paris, you're going to find that the communists are the leading force among the workers, right? In the labor movement, they have a really strong base already. I think by that point, and as you come out of this, this kind of out of occupation, and you go into this period of reconstruction, economic reconstruction, there is this massive wave of class struggle right after World War II, and they clearly play the leading role in it, right? So, I mean, partly it's the other parties of the left are a little bit discredited. The entire political system of the Third Republic, I would say, was pretty discredited. And you're kind of starting from something new. Partly it's the prestige that they had because of their role in the resistance. And I mean, it was the communists and the Gaullists, right? Those were the two, at least in historical memory, that's how people remember the two wings of the resistance. And France is classically, I mean, it's one of those countries in which, and there's a lot of like, how do we reckon with this? But in which it's like everyone says they were part of the resistance. Actually, the actual resistance to the Nazis was pretty tiny, right? But that's an important legacy that the communists led and had all of these they made famous partly, but these people who had died, who were communist militants, had died fighting the Nazis, right? And then the prestige of the Soviet Union, which in France that meant a lot, right? Was seen as the kind of the great liberator of Europe. I mean, I'll just say, I don't know how much people know about France, but you go to Paris and it's like, oh, the next stop on the 5 train or whatever is Stalingrad. You're like, it's great. That's still a very important memory for people. There. Also, by the way, I should say, still to this day, and these suburbs of Paris are often no longer controlled by the left. It's very depressing. But you'll go and it'll be like, all the streets will be like Rue Karl Marx and Avenue Lenin. It's everywhere, right? You see that history of kind of communist influence after World War II. Maybe a little bit of a tangent. But anyway, so besides the discrediting of the old political system and their role in the resistance, their role in the kind of class struggle after World War II really cemented their influence. And it was very clear that the CGT was going to be the dominant force for some time. Through the 1970s, in some ways even later, but in particularly, it was in manufacturing industries that the CGT was the leading force in the labor movement. And it was closely linked, closely allied. I mean, there was a whole galaxy of organizations, I think, someone says in this Phenomenal World volume, that the communists were built, but the CGT was the most important. And it's hard to, it's hard to overstate the impact that the union, the labor movement, had on the working class in France. Even though it couldn't carve out these kind of social democratic institutional powers, you did not get super centralized wage bargaining, right? You did not get lots of lots of negotiations with the unions over, but at the level of the workplace, the factory, they played an incredible politicizing role via the CGT. I mean, you talk to people who were trade union militants in the early 1970s, including people, by the way, who did not support the Communist Party, but come from other sections of the left. And the CGT could be pretty, a lot of people by the 70s thought it was kind of undemocratic and sort of Stalinisty, much like the Communist Party itself. But even people from other sections of the left talk about these incredible experiences of going with workers to, it's like our fantasy, like of, study groups on political economy with the 12 leading militants in your workplace, right? And you're reading a little bit, whatever it is, value, price, and profit, whatever it is, and have discussions about capitalism or, it had an enormous politicized effect. It was, I would say that the CGT actually, so, I mean, the other thing is that after World War II, you had this massive influx of non-European migrants from the former French colonies during this period, including especially Algeria. And the CGT played this huge role in integrating people into French society via the labor movement, via the trade union movement, right? So the communists were able to kind of construct this universe, this working class universe, via control of local governments, but via their influence on the class struggle in the workplace. And that was incredibly important. And no one on the socialist left had anything like that level of influence, essentially anywhere in the labor movement, at least until the 1970s, right? At least until the 70s and the formation of the Socialist Party. Even people who would vote for socialists particularly against the right when that was they did not have those kinds of links, right? To the kind of universe and that was via the Communist Party. Again, a long-winded answer to your question, but I hope
no, it perfectly winded. I guess one more question on that front that I'm just kind of curious about. To me, maybe part of the explanation here for the alliance that comes to form between the CGT and the communists has something to do with the CGT's fairly unique history of its own.
Sure.
As I'm sure this wasn't actually founded as a communist.
It was anarcho-syndicalist. Yeah,
this was an anarcho-syndicalist union that was militantly opposed not just to employers but to the state, and absolutely rejected for a long time any kind of formal or even, I guess, informal alliances with any kind of political party. So does that kind of, and actually other countries you see, especially after World War I, something of a confluence of the more syndicalist, radical syndicalist wings of the labor movement and communist political currents. Is that part of the equation here in the French case, or?
I mean, that's fascinating, right? I mean, as opposed to, for example, in Scandinavia, let's say, where the parties essentially founded the unions, is my understanding, right? I mean, more or less, or in other parts of Northern Europe. I mean, right? I don't. Look, that's a really interesting point. I feel unequipped to answer that fascinating question, but it makes a lot of sense to me. I don't actually. So are we editing this? Okay. There was a process by which after World War I, the communists took over the CGT, like during the 20s and the 30s. I don't actually know the details of it. I'm a little embarrassed to say. So, yeah. Yeah, so I can't answer that question, but it does make sense to me.
That's a really interesting question, Chris. You should write something about it. Maybe we can then now move to May 68. So, I mean, 1968 was very tumultuous in many parts of Europe, but in France, it was especially tumultuous. And, you know, demonstrations, occupations, industrial unrest, and the economy basically halted in May. So I'd love to have you talk a little bit about what it was that mobilized both the student movement and the labor movement so effectively at that time, and also about the political legacy, which you've started to talk about a little bit with all these different socialist and communist groups coming together.
Yeah, so to understand May 68, there's a few things you need to know about post-war France. So first of all, the kind of the system of Gaullist rule that had been constructed by the 1960s was pretty repressive at basically at every level, right? I mean, there was a lot of political repression, a lot of political violence, very famous examples of political violence. Probably most famously, there was a very famous massacre during the war in Algeria of several hundred Algerian demonstrators in Paris in October of 1961 who were drowned. I mean, they were thrown in the Seine and killed, you know, this kind of case that no one really talked about for a long time, but there's some memory of it. But just in general, there was not like a guarantee of political rights. And that level of repression, it extended to the different institutions of French society. So the universities were extremely anachronistic in their organization, and some of the rules would just seem batshit crazy to someone today that students had to deal with, you know, and there was a need for modernization there. There was a very backwards approach to things like gender, you know, under the Gaullists. These were, for all of his discussion of laïcité and commitment to secularism as kind of political principle, de Gaulle was very Catholic. He built a chapel in the Elysee Palace, right? You know, and had a very kind of old school view of kind of family and gender stuff. I mean, I think like legally, I wrote an article on May 68 people should read in Jacobin. I think it's called How Beautiful It Was. But I think it wasn't until the mid 60s that women could legally work without their husband's permission. I mean, it's stuff like that, you know. And then in the workplace, the lack of social democracy means that even where the unions are very strong, it's not like management is listening to people, right? Like they're not listening to the workers. There's not a lot of negotiation there. The way that plays out in the workplace is that when people get pissed off about something, particularly in a manufacturing industry, they just go out on strike. And so France in the 60s had very high levels of strikes, particularly these kinds of quickie, what were called quickie workplace strikes, where like workplace work stoppages, where unlike in a social, it was actually a reflection of their organizational weakness in some ways. Unlike in Sweden, where if a foreman does something that violates the contract, you have a meeting and the problem gets solved. In France, the problem doesn't get solved unless the workers walk out. So that's what they did, right? At the same time as you have these kind of high level of strikes, and the level of the strike figures kind of increase over this course of the 60s and then explode in 68, something like 150 million strike days lost just in 1968, compared to like, I think 1 million at the beginning of the decade. Anyway, in a year. So at the same time as you have this very rapid economic expansion. And this period in France is known as the Trente Glorieuses, the 30 glorious years. This period of economic reconstruction and expansion in which there is really zero unemployment. There's no unemployment in France. I mean, we're talking, 1% unemployment is a high figure, right? Everyone is working. The economy is growing rapidly. It does face a lot of problems. in part due to the lack of social democratic institutions. So what you might call overheating is constantly an issue. And that basically means, you have a year in which there's 5% growth, right? Wages, and there's no unemployment. Wages go up really quickly. And then businesses get really freaked out about like inflation, right? They get mad about it. They're worried because when purchasing power goes way up, people can buy lots of goods, right? And so that tends to drive the price of goods up. So the way that the French state dealt with this was that they would essentially engineer these economic slowdowns occasionally, right? They would pursue kind of restrictive economic policies to control inflation. In the year before, or like the 6 months before May 68, something like 500,000 people lost their job. There was a spike in employment. Now, compared to today, we're still talking very low employment, right? But which is important because it meant when everyone has a job, workers are more confident to go out and strike. But this pissed a lot of people off and worried people. And the other thing about this whole situation that you need to understand is that the way that the Gaullists managed this economic infrastructure was very top down. It was a state-led economic development model, dirigisme, basically they're leading. The state is leading the economy. The state has this very close links with business, and they construct this kind of planning regime. It's not a socialist planning regime, it's a capitalist planning regime, but in which they're funneling resources to firms and industries that they want to help. De Gaulle very explicitly had this economic model based on building up a few huge companies in strategic industries. He called them national champions, right? Like that was the term that was used. And the state was using its control over like credit, financial credit, right? To say, we want these people to grow, we want those people to grow. Now, this link between big business and the state, which excluded labor, one historian famously called it a conspiracy of big business and the state against the labor movement, right? So you have this whole situation in which lots of growth, economic modernization, actually what is a quite strong and militant labor movement in some ways, but organizationally very fragmented and denied really any institutional powers at all. I mean, even basic union rights in May 68, unions did not have, it was just their weight, their influence that allowed them to shape events. A very kind of a set of repressive, anachronistic institutions in the university system, which had grown tremendously, in other areas of society, of social life. And it all kind of comes to a head. You have this kind of bubbling cauldron. There was a lot of political violence. Like I said, there were a series of attempts on de Gaulle's life in the early 60s from the right, from inside from inside primarily the army. You had a group called the OAS, or the Secret Army Organization, tried to kill him. This whole situation kind of boils over in the late spring of 1968. And like you said, Maya, I mean, this was a year in which things were happening everywhere. And I don't think there's any other place on earth that you had such a concentrated, I mean, literally, this plays out the entire drama from beginning to end in about 2 months, right? And the peak of it is just a few weeks. But during this few weeks, you have what starts as a set of student protests, which escalate very quickly and take over the entire university system, right? And culminate on the night of the barricades, May 10th and 11th, 1968, which is, hundreds of people are fighting the CRS, the riot police in, on the French Quarter, near the Sorbonne, right? Like very famously, and they're building barricades. And so after this, and hundreds of people get arrested and lots of people get hurt. After this, you have a move into a general strike, which just it takes over, like it explodes. Within a couple of weeks, pretty much all the large factories in France have been occupied. I mean, literally occupied by their workers, right? There are different estimates about the number of workers who go out on strike. Is it 6 million workers who go out on strike? Is it 10 million? That's kind of the high end figure. But I think what everyone agrees on is that I'm pretty sure it's still the largest, at least extended general strike in European history. There may have been larger one day or right, like kind of, but it's the largest general strike in European history. And there's this complicated dance that happens on the left between the communists and the non-communist left. That includes the student radicals who gain a lot of prominence. Some of them, I mean, some of them become, major celebrities. Cohn-Bendit, probably most famously, right? But Danny the Red, but a number of others as well. And then also these socialist politicians and their parties who are all moving rapidly to the left, and actually generally are trying to outflank the Communist Party to the left by saying, we want socialism now, basically. And so you have this complicated dance. The Communist Party is very suspicious of the student movement. Its relationship to the events of May 68 is very complicated, not easy to pin down, right? Like, on the one hand, the party leadership of the PCF, the French Communist Party, is often very hostile. On the other hand, communist militants are driving the factory occupations, right? And they face incredible violence from the state, by the way, at the beginning of June. I mean, really some brutal incidents, which people can read about in this article I wrote, how beautiful it was. So, and then at the end of it, so it all kinds of comes crashing down. The government, de Gaulle at one point, so it thinks that he's about to be overthrown, right? Famously, he disappears to Germany. He goes to meet a French army general stationed in Germany, very famous one, Massacre, and he says, will you back me up if it comes to civil war? And he's worried there's going to be civil war. There's all these memoirs and contemporaneous accounts of ministers being like, so who has the guns when they storm into the halls of government and kill us? But de Gaulle manages to regain control of the situation and start to wind up the factory occupations by the middle of June. The students are super isolated and become easy targets for repression, and that kind of breaks down. Then he calls a referendum on a series of constitutional reforms, really a referendum about his rule, and he wins it. And he wins it in the classic French fashion, with all of this support from, kind of the, smaller property holders and the petty bourgeoisie, but large sections of French society. So he beats the left. But at the same time, May 68 is the end for de Gaulle. And that's complicated. It's not a victory for the right, actually. He's gone very soon after and dies not long after that. And it becomes a touchstone for a period of reformism that extends into the 70s. I mean, reformism on all fronts. Socially, you get things like the legalization of abortion and major changes in the education system. But economically, I mean, really massive reforms. I'll just give some examples. So there's a huge growth of the social security system, and massive expansion of things like early retirement during the course of the 1970s in France. They also create a national minimum wage. There was already a minimum wage, but the one they create, the SMIC, it ties the value of the minimum wage to inflation. So unlike in the United States, the minimum wage automatically is adjusted, right, so upwards, and creates a new baseline so that you get a higher and higher minimum wage. You get huge wage increases during the 70s in general for workers. And on the left, so you get the formation of a unified socialist party, and you get this real radicalization of all the sections of French socialism. Everyone is moving way to the left, no matter where you look. Out of this situation, so by 71, the Socialist Party exists. Mitterrand is its standard bearer. He is the kind of leading persona on the socialist left. And then he says, I want to negotiate an electoral deal, an alliance with the communists to present a unified left front for elections. Out of this, you get the agreement on what's called the Common Program. The Common Program, which is like a program, an agenda for government, which includes all of these reforms to kind of take steps, the steps towards socialism, basically, right? And that becomes kind of the focal point of left electoral politics during the 1970s, right? This agreement, the Common Program. You still get all the fighting within the labor movement, right? So now the CGT has real competitors. The CFDT, which is split away from its Catholic roots and is now like, we're for worker self-management and socialism. It has close links with sections of the Socialist Party, right? And so it is starting to build itself up. It's trying to present itself as like the more democratic alternative to communist unionism. And you get competition between them. And the Communist Party never trusted Mitterrand, right? There was this electoral agreement that was very important, right? So that's the aftermath of May 68.
It would be great to, to hear more about, so I guess what were the Communist Party's motivations in entering the United Front? What were they thinking that they were going to get out of it?
Yeah.
And just a little more about the program itself. What were they promising and how were they going to get it?
Yeah, so for the Communist Party, there's a couple things to say about that. So first of all, they had always, so they were everyone was of two minds. They were of two minds. They did not trust people like Mitterrand at all, very clearly. Had never trusted him, partly in the past for good reasons, but also after May 68, they see him as, even before then, he's the competition, right? A little bit. And he's very clear, we want to replace you. So, on the other hand, they had a vision of, they wanted to construct a legislative majority of the French left, and they couldn't do it alone ever, right? And they didn't want to be isolated, right? And also there was incredible pressure for unity, particularly after some of these defeats, like whatever. So after June of 68, like the left loses. There's another presidential election, like right after that. And the left loses again, right? There's pressure to in order just to beat the Gaullists, yeah? The Common Program and the right, not all of the right in France was Gaullist. There was an anti-Gaullist right too, which gained a lot of influence during the 70s. So the Common Program was an agenda, like kind of reform agenda. It becomes the Common Program is the basis for this alliance between communists and socialists, which, by the way, breaks down in 78. It's then kind of reformed when Mitterrand wins the presidency in 81. It becomes the basis for Mitterrand's electoral platform called the 110 Propositions for France. And it's this agenda that includes a number of large-scale economic, social, political reforms. Probably the single number one was the demand for widespread nationalization. Yeah, nationalization of private industry, particularly of key strategic industries. But the communists are very committed to an agenda of state ownership, essentially. Now, again, because of this history of planning in France, it's complicated how much of a break that is with the past. There were always significant state-owned industries in France. Also, private industry relied on the government for a huge amount of its financing, always. But the communists wanted to take it over and nationalization under workers' control kind of thing. But it also included, major plans for welfare reforms and, things around union rights and all kinds of changes like that. And I don't remember the exact language. Along with the Phenomenal World article, I also wrote a lengthy article about Mitterrand in Jacobin called The Many Lives of François Mitterrand. And it goes through some of the details of the language. But basically, it's like we're gonna take over the basically what it's saying is the commanding heights of the economy, right, and put them under public control, turn them into as a step towards giving the popular masses control over their economic destiny. That's basically what it comes down to. Yeah, and it's a very important document in the history of the French left. Yeah, really a touchstone of everything that's happened since then.
Maybe just quickly before talking more about Mitterrand and his dramatic turn, I would love to hear a bit about the Communist Party's relationship to other communist parties in this period. You know, we have Euro-communism emerging, and a lot of communist parties are undergoing this period of reform, rethinking their relationship to the Soviet Union. What's happening in the French Communist Party?
Yeah, so the French Communist Party resists the Euro-communist turn. They refer to Euro-communists as les Italiens, the Italians, you know, kind of like derisively, basically. You know, they're mocking Chris's people, but they are, I mean, through the 1970s, they are pretty committed to defending the foreign policy turns of the Soviet Union pretty consistently. That also plays out in the labor movement. So some of the beef, the way that, you know, so like at the end of the decade, the CGT and the CFDT are like fighting about this Afghanistan, right? Like, you know, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, that kind of stuff. Because the CGT still takes these positions, right? Generally in line with Soviet foreign policy, but they are not a Euro-communist party. They are not let 1,000 flowers bloom. They did not go down. That was not their, you know, their vision of how things would play out. Yeah, and that also is part of, if I'm remembering correctly, why the original. So it's after the 77 local elections, in which the left does really well, that the initial alliance between Mitterrand's socialists and the communists, the common program, that alliance collapses. And I think a lot of it had to do with foreign policy stuff that was about relationship to the Soviet Union, if I'm remembering. Yeah. Can I just read? Oh, go ahead.
Well, yeah, before you get to that, my question that I wanted to ask has to do with why and how Mitterrand and the PS are able, the PS, excuse me, are able to overtake the communists during this period. You know, going into the common program, it's the communists who are the larger force on the French left in terms of members, in terms of vote share, in terms of strength or influence in the labor movement. By the time Mitterrand gets elected president in 1981, you know, the tables had turned, and it was the socialists who had established themselves as the leading force in the French left. How does that work? And yeah, is this, you know, I was curious as to whether this particular question, this question of foreign policy, of the relationship to the Soviets, of the PCF's real resistance to some of the kind of more reforming, renovatory currents that are flowing through European communism in this period have anything to do with that?
Yeah. So first of all, we should qualify this a little bit, because it is still true that, like, at a municipal level, the communists are untouchable, right? At a local level, so like I said, I think in the 77 elections, they come out running like a third of cities with more than 30,000 people in France. A third. 1 out of every 3 cities with more than 30,000 people is communist run after 1977. And the CGT still has, again, like I said, membership isn't always the best way to measure these things. You also have to look at things like there are different workplace elections, you know, but they have like 2 million members through the 70s, and they are still the strongest force in the labor movement. I think what you're saying, though, is all important. So first of all, look, there's just no way around like some of the stigma of whether it's Czechoslovakia or, right, you know, the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, and, you know, and it's complicated. There's a lot to say about Soviet foreign policy during the 1970s, where it's very good, where it's bad, but some of the stigma around what's seen as kind of a repressive, sclerotic society, that's having an impact, obviously, right, during the 70s on. I think more fundamentally at the national level, the communists are not, so they're seen as kind of, not just kind of too traditionalist and kind of conservative. I don't mean politically conservative. I mean literally kind of stuck in their ways, let's say this, and kind of anachronistic a little bit, and not open, not flexible. But they're also seen as the big barriers to unity. And this was Mitterrand's kind of great strategic victory over them. He was able to present himself as the torchbearer for a unified left, right? I am for the whole left getting together and pursuing a French road to socialism. And these conservative sectarians of the Communist Party are impeding that. So even my impression is that when the alliance breaks briefly in the late 70s, it's the communists who end up bearing, I think they were the ones who walked out of it. I don't remember all the details, but bear most of the stigma actually for that. And he is like, I represent our, the whole left against Gaullism and against the right? That's what I represent. And then the communists represent their kind of narrow particular interests, essentially. I don't know if that, he also constructs this party that is much more dynamic than anything French socialism had had in some time, right? And more dynamic and includes all the different forces of French socialism. He's a more dynamic public figure. He's a very good speaker, by the way. He was a great politician, truly a great politician. The communists did not have great politicians during the 1970s and 80s. Again, I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
It does, yeah, at least in part, yes, for sure.
Do you think now is a good time for your quotes reading?
Yeah, let's talk about Mitterrand and how much he moves to the left after 1968. So he gives a very famous speech at Épinay, which is this Congress in 1971, where he becomes the torchbearer of the newly formed Socialist Party. And the speech culminates in a very famous passage where he says, "Reform or revolution?" I want to say yes, revolution. And I would immediately point out the daily struggle for structural reforms can be revolutionary in nature. But what I have just said could be an alibi if I did not add a second sentence. Violent or peaceful, revolution is first of all a break or a rupture. He who does not accept the break and the method that follows from it, one who is not willing to break with the established order, with capitalist society, that person, I say, cannot be a member of the Socialist Party. And then afterwards, he's given a press conference, and very famously he says, you can manage capitalist society, or you can found a socialist society. As far as we're concerned, we want to be the second. So, he sounds like, and I don't mean, it's not that he was lying, this is the trajectory of French socialism, right? This is where, that's the center of politics. That's not an outlier. That's not an unusual viewpoint on the socialist left. And that's what people want. That's what they're thinking about in the early 70s. And he articulates this like, this is the great irony, I would say, of the entire experience of post-war French social democracy. It goes from the wilderness to the center of the left under Mitterrand, at the same time as he's trying to build social democracy into something, right? To compete with the communist left, to create a French social democracy. It's also going through this radicalization. So those two things are happening simultaneously. He's trying to construct a social democracy where one does not previously exist, and being like, this is our road to socialism. And France, I think, is really the only country in Europe where you see anything equivalent to that during the post-war period, right? Those two things happening simultaneously, right? The invention of social democracy and the invention of a radical left-wing social democracy are happening at once.
I think if Bernie said anything near that quote, the whole world would fall apart and call him a Maoist.
All politics is contextual, right? And in what it means to advance the class struggle at one time and place is different. At that time and place, that's where politics was in 1971 in France, right?
Yeah, no, it's really reflective of the period.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he gets in 1981, and I think he does actually undertake some of these nationalizations, right? But then
Yes.
by 1983, 84, he makes this huge backtrack. So why is he forced to backtrack? And what form does his backtracking take? What kind of deregulation does he pursue?
Yeah. So so he wins in May of 1981. He wins the presidential election. So he enters the Élysée Palace in May of 1981. 5 weeks later, and this is often, again, a pattern in French politics. So voters are like, we've just elected a president from the left. We have to give them a parliamentary majority too. So the left wins legislative elections 5 weeks later, which is, so now you have, basically he gets to form his own government, right? The cabinet, which depends on the balance of power in parliament, under the president, who has a lot of executive authority, they're both of the left. And so they're able to institute this agenda, very extensive nationalizations, dozens of companies. Basically, the entire banking system is nationalized. Big increases in the minimum wage, huge expansion of the welfare state. There's all sorts of reforms that get passed during the early period of the Mitterrand years. Again, what's crucial though is that by this point, the Trente Glorieuses are over, the 30 glorious years, and the French economy is really stalled out. And they already face these big problems with unemployment and inflation, spiraling inflation. I mean, think about it. Inflation is happening at this point. Yes, wages are rising, but because they're not producing enough stuff, right? There's not enough new investment in a capitalist economy that's gone into crisis. And so there's just not enough production to meet, to meet demand. And so prices are going up. Domestic production in particular, they're very reliant on imports for a whole bunch of things, which causes problems. And for reasons that we'll get into in a second. But so he comes to power at this time in which there are these huge economic problems, probably that contributed to his victory. It certainly meant that he was able to get away with pursuing certain reforms like the extensive nationalizations. I mean, some of the stuff that he did, it wasn't entirely new. I'll give you an example. So Mitterrand massively expanded the welfare state in a bunch of ways, like family benefits went up a lot, and unemployment. But already under the previous right-wing government, French governments, given the political realities they faced, they were like, okay, we have to deal with unemployment as a growing problem. And one of the main ways they dealt with it was through this huge increase in early retirement. So that by the early 80s, there's lots and lots of workers who are retiring in their mid-50s with pensions that are worth, or earlier in some cases, pensions that are worth 100% or more sometimes of their maximum wage, right? Like annual pensions. So that was already happening. Also, there was already big capital flight going on, like capital was fleeing the country. That had already begun before Mitterrand gets elected. So he comes in, he pursues this reform agenda, which you could think of as like a expansionary macroeconomic kind of Keynesian reform agenda, sort of in line partially with some of the previous directions in government economic policy in France, the state-led model, but also with lots of new twists and turns. I mean, like, for example, Mitterrand passed these laws, the Aureau laws, union laws, which gave unions all these rights which they had never previously enjoyed. Part of his attempt to construct a French social democracy, right? Like, it gave labor all sorts of rights they had previously never had. And he reduces the work week from 40, I guess it was like 40, 41, 40 hours to 39, and he promises we're going to bring it down to 35. So the legal work week goes to 39 hours. He does all this stuff. And in some ways, it limits the extent of the economic damage in the short run. He comes to power at a time in which there's a global economic crisis, right? There's huge increases in unemployment from the United States to Britain to Germany. In the US, the 79 recession was really damaging. In France, it devastated key industries like steel, shipbuilding, really absolutely devastated by that recession. Also, he comes to power in a context in which there have been steps taken to construct this kind of integrated European, economy, right? What would later become the European Monetary Union, the Eurozone, that kind of stuff. So that what existed at the time was what was called the European Monetary System, in which countries maintained their own currencies, but those currencies were pegged to one another at a certain rate via something called the exchange rate mechanism. And in particular, the French franc which was their money, their dollar, was pegged to the German Deutschmark, and Germany had the largest and strongest economy in Europe. And its monetary policy was controlled by this very powerful central bank, the Bundesbank, which pursued the opposite kinds of economic policies to the ones Mitterrand. And because of the weight of German capitalism, and because the French economy was still very reliant on imports for all sorts of stuff, that kind of conservative, restrictive economic, those policies pursued in Germany and also in the US under Reagan had a huge impact on, really constrained Mitterrand, put enormous pressure on their currency, downward pressure on the franc, right? Like, for reasons, you should read my longer Jacobin article, gets into this stuff. But basically, Mitterrand had to decide at some point. So inflation is going way up. We are running what's called the balance of payments deficits. We're facing a lot of problems. Let's say that. Are we going to drop out of the European monetary system and kind of go it alone and risk being cut off from international capitalism, essentially, and face huge domestic opposition, resistance already building up? Or are we going to pull back from our economic agenda? And by the summer of 1982, I mean, there's like a summit that happens. He has with Reagan and Thatcher and, Schmidt. Helmut Schmidt was the Chancellor of Germany, West Germany at the time. Anyway, he's basically, he like begs the Reagan administration, supposedly, which was pursuing very restrictive economic policies, to change their course a little bit. And Reagan said no. And after that, Mitterrand institutes the first, it was actually the second, what's called the devaluation of the franc. But basically, they end up freezing wages and prices, and they cut taxes and spending a little bit. So that happens. The big turnaround. This pause happens in 1982. Then in 1983, it's the U-turn, the course reversal. And after that, after the spring of 1983, the 110 propositions for France is dead. It's over. The common program, all of the policies are gone. And they've now Mitterrand says, instead of fighting unemployment and trying to get everyone a job and increasing people's wages and living standards, our main goal is fighting inflation. And so basically they let unemployment balloon. They let all these nationalized companies, which had been losing money, a lot of them, right? Because they had nationalized a lot of the companies that were ready to go out of business. They let them go out of business or cut jobs, basically. They cut spending. They really do a full course reversal. And it is the end of the French road to socialism. I mean, so when he gets elected, Mitterrand includes famously 4 communist ministers. That was his deal with the Communist Party. After the 84 European elections, the communists are gone. There's a cabinet reshuffle, and a more conservative cabinet comes in. He loses a ton of his popularity. I mean, I think Mitterrand's popularity, his approval ratings peaked at like almost 3/4 of the public approved of him at some point in 1982. By 84, he's down to like 30%, which at the time was like a historic low. I mean, no one likes to lose their job, right? I mean, that sucks. So people, and then in 86, the left loses parliamentary elections. And basically you have Mitterrand and then a conservative, a neo-Gaullist prime minister under him. which is Chirac, who would later be his successor. And that's true for 2 years. He gets reelected in 88. I mean, he's such a dominant, overwhelming figure. It's hard to explain what his nickname was God. Literally, his nickname was God. Like that, that's what people called him. So, but it's the end of the French road to socialism, and he pursues very different policies. And again, in every sphere, his foreign policy becomes way more conservative. He passed all these social reforms the first couple of years, and he pursues a much more conservative agenda after that. Now, the Communist Party really takes the brunt of things, and their era of dominance on the French left is over. By the 90s, they're a mid-level party, and in 95, the CGT cuts its links with the Communist Party. Obviously, the end of the Soviet Union has an impact on that. And there's a complicated relationship across the left after that. There's a left government that comes to power in 97, but it's just not in an alliance with the socialists and communists. It's never the same after 83, I guess is what I would say. Now, it's very complicated. Like the debate it's the eternal debate. Could he have gone in the other direction? Could he have doubled down on the French road to socialism, kept the nationalizations, or were objective conditions make that impossible? There are some great quotes. I'm not going to bore everyone with them, but what I would say is that this is the complicated legacy of this for me. For just if we set aside for a question the nature of Mitterrand's personal opportunism or his kind of, he had sort of a technocrat. He was a very top-down view of politics, sure. If we set all that, the personal foibles aside for a second, and the fights within the government, the maneuvering in the cabinet, and there's a lot to say about all of that. Part of what the issue here is that the left's electoral success was shaped by this profound crisis of post-war French capitalism, the entire model of French capitalism. But that same crisis imposed incredible restraints, really made real dilemmas on the government once it came to power as it tried to pursue its agenda. So both of those things are true at once, right? It was a boost to the left's electoral fortunes. I mean, people are celebrating the night Mitterrand wins in May of 81, and it's a big party for the whole left. I think it would have been impossible without this kind of crisis that descended in the 70s. But those constraints are very hard to overcome, to think past. That's the quick and dirty, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I always ask this question of alternatives, and I think I also asked it of you in the Phenomenal World piece, and it's a really tough one.
Yeah.
But I think maybe take us through the kind of trajectory of neoliberalism after Mitterrand. I guess it's not in France, from what I understand, it's not really like this Reagan Thatcher kind of extremely overt breaking of the labor movement. It's much more kind of progressive and legal. Love to hear you talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so this happens, it absolutely is a process. In the 90s, there's widespread privatizations, starting under governments of the right, but then also under governments of the left. Even then, though, there are some important reforms that are passed. I mean, another left government that comes to power in 97 passes the 35-hour work week, which is has a complicated legacy. So the legal work week, they reduced from 39 to 35, for example. There's also this massive welfare state that is a legacy, not just of the Mitterrand period, but of the 70s as well. I mean, by the end of the 90s, the average retirement age in France is, I think, 59. And Social Security makes up over 25% of GDP, right? Like, so over 25% goes to unemployment and the whole, retirement, disability insurance, accident insurance, that kind of stuff. People can't just gut that stuff. And they can't for political reasons in France. And France has this reputation of people are on strike all the time. It's actually not true. In particular, in private companies, strikes are really rare now. They've really disappeared. The labor movement got gutted during the 80s. The CGT's membership fell by more than half. I mean, it really, a lot more than half. It went from over 2 million, I think, at its low point, maybe 600,000 or something. And its influence really fell. A lot of the industries that had been most deeply rooted in collapsed, essentially. At the same time, you do have this dynamic where every time the government tries to do something like gut pensions, gut retirement insurance, they run the risk of some huge, explosive 3-week-long strike/protest movement. Probably the most famous example of that was in December 1995. So Mitterrand is gone, right? But there's a conservative prime minister named Alain Juppé, and Juppé tries to cut public sector pensions. And basically, France's transportation system comes to a halt for 3 weeks before Christmas. The national rail system and the Paris subway system and everyone is, and so they're forced to back down. And there's a series of kind of social explosions, protest movements that limit their ability to just gut things, right? You can't do that politically in France. It doesn't work that way. Instead, what they do is they figure out ways to get around on the edges, right? So, okay, maybe we can't really gut retirement pensions, but we can increase the minimum contribution years for this set of workers, right? We could go after what are called the special regimes with certain groups of workers who have particularly generous pensions. Well, we can, we can't say that employers can just fire workers whenever, but we can, whatever. There's a bunch of ways in which they try and get around some of these rules. Probably the biggest strategy, I would say today, their main strategy of French employers and kind of neoliberal reformers is you kind of relax labor laws, labor protections for workers. And the way you frame it is in terms of decentralized negotiations. So you say, these things shouldn't be decided in Paris. Instead, we're going to have workers bargain with employers at the company level, not at the sector level as traditionally, but at the company level, including often without union representatives there. And those agreements, they'll be more flexible, they'll be more attuned to what companies need and what workers need. And they have almost always become this vehicle for undermining essentially labor standards. And that has happened everywhere. There have been all kinds of cuts and changes in the welfare system. France still spends a lot on welfare, social welfare, right? Up until it may still be among the leaders in Europe. It has a different system. It's not as universal as the Scandinavian system. It's not as redistributive, but it still spends a lot. But there have been these kinds of cuts, and they've really transformed the terrain socially, economically, and politically. Hold on 1 second.
No worries.
Sorry, is this okay?
Oh yeah, totally.
Okay.
Sorry about my phone call before. Sorry about my phone going off.
Oh,
I
no,
thought
I
it was yours.
No.
I'm just worried she's gonna start first.
That's fine. We're recording this, right?
Okay.
So I might get interrupted. Yeah. We're almost done, right? We're going to wrap up.
Yeah, I mean, why don't we just, because I know it's been a while. So let's just skip over. I did want to talk a little bit about the EU, but I think we can leave that for another time. And let's just talk a little bit about recent events. We had Mélenchon's kind of little rise of like 19%, I think it was, in 2017. It kind of fell away. At the same time, we've had kind of Macron emerge as this kind of technocrat. We've had Le Pen. What's going on? What do each of these developments reflect about French society in recent decades?
So let me say this: it is not a good political situation right now, and that's the truth. Probably anywhere in Europe, certainly not in France. You still get I mean, I guess this is some signs of hope. There could be big protest movements, strike movements. There's supposed to be a strike around Omicron on Thursday, on the January 13th. We'll see how that plays out. But politics, there's a real reactionary turn in French politics. Macron has not been a barrier to that. He's at the level of things like policing or social policy or immigration. He has enabled the right utterly and completely. His neoliberal economic policies, I think, have been really devastating. It's an utter mistake for American liberals to see him as some barrier to the right. That is just the wrong. It's clearly not the case.
Yeah.
The left has been really hammered. You know, the Socialist Party got really wiped out in 2017 so there had been a president, Francois Hollande,
Right.
Holland, who was elected in 2012, who was, who actually brought Macron in, right, to the, to the government, and who was not a socialist, never a socialist, but really super unpopular, devastating neoliberal economic reforms. The economy remains pretty sclerotic. And I would say that, I mean, the terms of debate are set on the right, including the far right. Just to say, and this goes back to some of the history that we talked about, Marine Le Pen, who is very likely going to be in the runoff, so French presidential elections, there's a 2-round, right, is the far right candidate, hates Muslims, hates immigrants, against Macron. That's the betting favorite. Her father was kind of this pace setter for the rise of this new European far right in the 80s, Jean-Marie Le Pen. He had been, a kind of fascist sympathizer. He had fought in Algeria. He was a paratrooper, bragged about torturing people, famous for his jokes about the Holocaust, not funny jokes, bad jokes about the Holocaust. And so he had been tried to kind of lead wanted to be a leader of the far right. In the 70s, he was so marginal, he couldn't even collect enough signatures. You had to get 500 signatures from local mayors, right, to get on and there are mayors everywhere in France, but to get on the ballot, he couldn't do it. It was literally immediately after Mitterrand's U-turn that he starts surging. First, in 83, the far right has some impact in local elections, and then 84 European elections is their big breakthrough. And then the 88 presidential election, he becomes a major force, gets double-digit vote share. And so that's the beginning of this rise of the far right turn. I don't know where this ends or what the left does. I mean, like you said, Mélenchon's campaign, I was in Paris when, and people were very hopeful.
Yeah.
And then, the results were announced in the first round, and it became clear that it would be Macron versus Marine Le Pen. And that was, it's terrible. It's a terrible thing. And then you have people like Eric Zemmour, who's other figures on the far right. So it's not a good situation right now, I guess, is what I would say. But not to lead people on
I mean, let's hope for better days to come. Every so often there is one of these great uprisings, Nuit debout or Gilets jaunes, that kind of shake things up. So,
or the CPE movement in 2006, all of these. Yeah. And, I mean, part of the issue, you're totally right. You can hope for that. But I think in the past is that the French left for some time believed, or large sections of it, that it could be saved by its ability to by these mobilizations, right? That you could mobilize people against a government, of an unpopular government, for a month. 2 million people will take part in protests, and that will be the source of your strength. And then you could just kind of run. But I'm not sure that there's a political strategy, or certainly not agreement on one, about how to move forward, right? And in the end, I don't think that those social explosions were enough, right? I mean, what's the politics that comes out of it? I'm not sure anyone has figured that out. I don't think there's any organization on the French left that it's kind of capable of cohering right now a new kind of alternative to from the left politics. So
yeah, and I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned for us on the left in the US from what you just said and from the French experience.
yeah,
So thank you so much, Jonah. That was
yeah.
really
Thanks for doing this.
Chris unfortunately had to step out, but we really, really love talking with you. And yeah, we will be in touch.